George Whitaker, a quirky 72-year-old with a flair for the dramatic, shocks his sleepy suburban town by blowing his entire pension on renting a private jet for a week. His neighbors think he's finally lost it. George barely leaves the house, let alone flies private. As whispers swirl about midlife crises arriving decades late, no one could imagine the emotional storm that his audacious decision would unleash. What begins as a wild ride of comedy turns into something far deeper and unforgettable. George Whitaker's morning started like any other in the sleepy town of Westfield. Birds chirped outside his window, the coffee maker sputtered and groaned in his modest kitchen, and the neighborhood cat, Molly, lounged on his front porch as if she owned the place. At 72 years old, George had fallen into a routine that most people his age would envy. Quiet, predictable, and unremarkably peaceful. But peace, as George decided that day, was overrated. It all began with a letter. Sitting at his kitchen table, the envelope in front of him was marked with the unmistakable logo of his pension provider. He opened it with a sigh, expecting the usual numbers and statements that hardly mattered anymore. But as he scanned the contents, something clicked in his mind. The balance was enough to live comfortably for the rest of his days. But comfort, George thought, was no longer what he wanted. Comfort hadn't brought him joy. Comfort hadn't brought him adventure. He glanced at the photo on his fridge, a candid shot of his younger self with his late wife, Margaret. She was mid-laugh, her head thrown back as if she just heard the world's funniest joke. George felt a pang of longing. Margaret had been the spark in his life, the one who dragged him into adventures he never thought he'd dare to embark on. Without her, life had dulled into a series of mundane repetitions. "What would you do, Maggie?" he muttered under his breath. The answer, as it turned out, came to him faster than expected. An ad popped up on his ancient laptop as he browsed aimlessly. "Rent a private jet. Luxury awaits you." George laughed out loud. Who would waste money like that? But as he stared at the ad, something inside him stirred. Why not? What if he could shake things up one last time, not just for himself, but for others too? Margaret had always believed in living big, even when their bank account didn't agree. And so, with a grin that hadn't graced his face in years, George clicked the ad. The next morning, Westfield was buzzing. George Whitaker, the town's quietest resident, had apparently rented a private jet for an entire week. "He's gone mad," Mrs. Crowley from next door whispered to her husband. "Completely lost his marbles." George didn't care. Wearing a Hawaiian shirt he'd found at the back of his closet and a pair of aviators that hadn't seen daylight since the 80s, he strode through town like a man on a mission. And he was. At the airstrip, he met Sabrina Clark, the jet's pilot. Sabrina was a seasoned professional who had flown celebrities and billionaires across the globe. She took one look at George and almost refused the job. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her arms crossed as she eyed his mismatched outfit and the duffel bag he carried like a rebellious teenager running away from home. "Absolutely," George replied, his grin widening. "I'm about to have the time of my life." Sabrina wasn't convinced, but a job was a job. As they prepared for takeoff, George surprised her by inviting several random strangers aboard. Marcus, a 16-year-old tech whiz who lived down the street, Mrs. Patel, a retired schoolteacher who hadn't left Westfield in decades, and Nina, a waitress from the local diner who had always dreamed of seeing the world. "What is this, some kind of charity event?" Sabrina muttered under her breath as the unlikely group boarded the jet. The first flight was chaotic, to say the least. Marcus brought his gadgets and promptly turned the cabin into a Wi-Fi hotspot. Mrs. Patel complained about the turbulence, clutching her knitting needles like they were her lifeline. Nina couldn't stop grinning, taking selfies at every opportunity. George, meanwhile, played the role of a gleeful host, offering champagne to anyone who'd take it and narrating their journey like a tour guide on a mission to entertain. "Where are we going, anyway?" Sabrina finally asked as they cruised above the clouds. George's answer was as cryptic as it was ridiculous. You'll see. By the second day, the group started to bond, albeit reluctantly. Marcus taught Mrs. Patel how to use Instagram, much to her initial annoyance but eventual delight. Nina shared stories of her dream to become a travel writer, earning nods of encouragement from George. Even Sabrina, who usually kept her distance from clients, found herself intrigued by the motley crew. George's antics were still baffling, but there was something infectious about his enthusiasm. As the days passed, the jet stopped in unexpected places. A remote beach, a bustling city, and even a tiny island that wasn't on any map. Each destination seemed random, but George had a plan. He just wasn't ready to share it yet. For now, he was content watching his companions rediscover parts of themselves they'd forgotten existed. He saw Marcus smile like a kid instead of a jaded teenager. He saw Mrs. Patel laugh like she hadn't in years. He saw Nina's eyes light up with the kind of wonder that Margaret would have adored. For George, this wasn't just a joyride. It was a chance to live the way Margaret had always wanted them to, boldly, unapologetically, and with an open heart. He could almost hear her laughter in the wind as the jet soared through the sky. And for the first time in a long time, George felt alive. The jet touched down on its first destination, a sun-drenched beach that stretched as far as the eye could see. The moment the group disembarked, the chaos began anew. Marcus, barely out of the jet, was running around with the drone he had brought, trying to capture cinematic shots for his social media page. Mrs. Patel, on the other hand, clung to her sun hat like it was her only defense against the vastness of the ocean. Nina, wide-eyed, was snapping pictures of everything, from the coconut trees to the shells scattered across the sand. George, however, stood quietly for a moment, gazing out at the horizon. His mismatched Hawaiian shirt flapped in the breeze, and for the first time since boarding the jet, he seemed lost in thought. Sabrina noticed this and approached him cautiously. "Okay, George, I have to ask. What's the plan here? Are we just hopping from place to place with no rhyme or reason?" George turned to her, a sly grin forming on his face. "Patience, my dear captain. All will be revealed in time." Sabrina rolled her eyes. She had dealt with her share of eccentric clients before, but George was something else entirely. Still, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. What was this man really up to? As the day went on, the group slowly began to shed their reservations. Marcus taught Nina how to fly his drone, much to her delight. Mrs. Patel, initially resistant to the idea of getting her feet wet, was eventually coaxed into wading into the shallow waves by George himself. Sabrina, meanwhile, found herself loosening up as well. She let Marcus snap a picture of her, something she hadn't allowed in years. By sunset, the group was sitting around a makeshift bonfire that George had insisted they build. They roasted marshmallows, told stories, and laughed in a way that felt genuine and unforced. For the first time, they were more than just a random collection of strangers. They were starting to feel like a team. But as the stars began to dot the sky, George's demeanor shifted again. He pulled out an old, weathered notebook from his duffel bag. "I'd like to read you all something," he said, his voice quieter now. The group fell silent as George began to read an entry from the notebook. It was a letter addressed to Margaret. In it, George described his dream of visiting places they had talked about but never had the chance to see together. He spoke of the adventures they had planned, the memories they had hoped to create, and the regret he felt for not pursuing those dreams while they still had time. The group listened intently, their earlier laughter replaced by a quiet reverence. Even Sabrina, who had been skeptical of George from the start, found herself deeply moved. When George finished reading, he looked up at the group with a sheepish smile. "Margaret was the adventurous one, you know. She used to drag me out of my comfort zone all the time. I thought I was doing this for her, but I think—" He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I think I'm doing it for me, too." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Patel, of all people, broke the silence. "George," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "thank you for bringing us along. I haven't felt this alive in years." The others nodded in agreement, each expressing their gratitude in their own way. Marcus, who rarely spoke about his feelings, simply said, "This is cool, George. Thanks." The night ended on a somber but hopeful note. As the group made their way back to the jet, Sabrina pulled George aside. "You're not just doing this for yourself, are you?" she asked. George shrugged, a twinkle in his eye. "Maybe not. But does it matter?" Sabrina didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in her career, she found herself genuinely looking forward to the next destination. The next morning, the jet was back in the air, and George was back to his playful self. "Where to next?" Sabrina asked, more curious than annoyed this time. George grinned. "Oh, you'll love this one. Trust me." As the group settled into the flight, George began weaving tales of the next location. "It's got waterfalls," he teased. "Huge ones. And there's a little cafe nearby where they serve the best coffee you'll ever taste." "Waterfalls and coffee?" Marcus smirked. "We flew a jet for that." George wagged a finger at him. "Ah, young man, never underestimate the power of simple pleasures." The rest of the group chuckled, though they couldn't help but wonder if George's itinerary was as random as it seemed. But as the jet ascended into the clouds, something unspoken lingered in the cabin. They were beginning to trust George, not just his eccentricity, but the heart behind it. And so their journey continued, each of them carrying not just their belongings but the beginnings of a bond they hadn't anticipated. What awaited them at the next stop was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain. Life was no longer predictable, and that was exactly what they needed. The jet soared above a blanket of clouds as the group speculated about their next destination. George was tight-lipped as usual, which only fueled Marcus's curiosity. "It's probably another beach," he muttered, fiddling with his drone. "Or maybe a farm. George seems to like keeping it low-key." "You're complaining?" Mrs. Patel said, raising an eyebrow. "We're on a private jet. The last time I traveled it was by bus, and I had to share my seat with a chicken." The cabin burst into laughter. Even Sabrina cracked a smile. George, perched comfortably near a window with his notebook, grinned but didn't offer any clues. Instead, he simply said, "Trust the process." When the jet finally landed, it was anything but low-key. They found themselves in a bustling city surrounded by towering skyscrapers and neon lights that illuminated the night sky. The hum of activity was palpable, the streets alive with music, laughter, and the aroma of street food. Nina's jaw dropped as she stepped out of the jet. This is incredible. Where are we?" "Somewhere you'll never forget," George replied cryptically. The group piled into a cab. Much to Marcus's dismay, he had hoped for a limousine and headed toward their accommodations. George had spared no expense, booking a luxurious penthouse suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the city. As they explored the space, the group couldn't help but marvel at the opulence. "This place looks like something out of a movie," Marcus said, snapping pictures on his phone. "Are we really staying here?" "Only the best," George said with a wink. But George wasn't just here to splurge. As the group settled in, he handed each of them an envelope. Inside was a personal itinerary. Nina's included a photography workshop with a world-renowned artist. Marcus's listed a visit to a state-of-the-art tech lab. Mrs. Patel's contained tickets to a classical music performance at a historic theater. Even Sabrina found herself holding an invitation to a private aviation expo. "What's this all about?" Sabrina asked, holding up her envelope. "It's about living," George said simply. "Margaret and I always talked about trying new things, pushing ourselves beyond what we thought we were capable of. I want all of you to experience that." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Patel, blinking back tears, said, "You're a remarkable man, George Whitaker." Over the next 2 days, the group embarked on their individual adventures. Nina returned from her photography workshop beaming, her camera filled with shots she was proud of for the first time in years. Marcus couldn't stop talking about the tech lab, where he had not only seen prototypes of cutting-edge devices but had also been offered an internship. Mrs. Patel was equally ecstatic, describing the symphony as a transcendent experience. Even Sabrina, who had initially been skeptical about the aviation expo, admitted she had enjoyed herself. "It reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place," she told George over dinner, "to chase the horizon and see the world." George listened intently, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "And now, you've remembered." On their final night in the city, the group gathered on the penthouse balcony, toasting to George and to the experiences they had shared. The mood was light, but beneath the laughter was a sense of profound gratitude. Each of them had been given something they hadn't even realized they needed. As they clinked glasses, George grew quiet, staring out at the city lights. "Margaret would have loved this place," he said softly. "She always wanted to see the world from a rooftop like this." The group fell silent, letting George have his moment. Nina reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "She'd be proud of you, George, of what you're doing here." George smiled, though his eyes glistened. "I hope so," he said. "I really do." The next morning, as the jet prepared for takeoff, the group gathered in the cabin, buzzing with excitement for the next leg of their journey. George, as always, remained mysterious about their destination, but his enthusiasm was infectious. "Are you ever going to tell us where we're going before we land?" Marcus asked. "Where's the fun in that?" George replied, chuckling. "But I will say this. The next stop is going to take your breath away." The group couldn't help but laugh, but there was an unspoken understanding now, a trust that whatever George had planned would be worth the journey. Even Sabrina, who prided herself on keeping her emotions in check, felt a strange warmth spreading in her chest. It wasn't just about the destinations anymore. It was about what they were finding along the way. And with that, the jet ascended into the sky, leaving the city, and the memories they had made there, behind. Each member of the group felt a little lighter, a little braver, and a lot more connected, not just to each other, but to the world around them. For the first time in a long time, they felt alive. As the jet descended, the passengers were greeted by a breathtaking view of lush, green mountains and cascading waterfalls. The group erupted in collective awe as the scenery unfolded beneath them. "Now, this is something," Marcus said, his nose practically pressed against the window. Nina was furiously snapping photos, already planning her captions for the pictures. Even Mrs. Patel, who usually reserved her enthusiasm, let out a soft gasp. "Where are we?" Sabrina asked, glancing at George, who was seated with his usual mysterious grin. "A place I've always dreamed of visiting," George said simply, "and a place I think you'll all appreciate." The jet landed on a small, secluded airstrip nestled in the heart of the mountains. Waiting for them was a local guide named Mateo, who greeted them warmly and introduced himself with an infectious enthusiasm. "Welcome to Valle del Corazon," he said, gesturing to the surrounding landscape. "This valley is known as the heart of the world, and trust me, you're about to see why." The group piled into an open-air jeep that bumped along a winding dirt road, taking them deeper into the valley. The air was crisp, and the sound of rushing water from nearby streams accompanied their journey. Marcus had his drone out again, capturing every angle of the spectacular surroundings, while Mrs. Patel clutched her sun hat like it might fly away. Nina couldn't stop smiling, her excitement bubbling over with every turn in the road. Sabrina, ever the skeptic, found herself leaning into the magic of the moment despite herself. Their first stop was a hidden waterfall that could only be reached by foot. Mateo led the way, guiding the group through a dense forest until the sound of roaring water grew louder. When they finally emerged from the trees, the sight before them left everyone speechless. The waterfall cascaded down in a shimmering curtain, creating a pool at its base that sparkled in the sunlight. "It's beautiful," Nina whispered, raising her camera to capture the scene. But George wasn't content to merely look. "Who's up for a swim?" he asked, already kicking off his shoes. The group exchanged hesitant glances, but George's infectious enthusiasm quickly wore them down. Soon they were all wading into the cool, refreshing water. Even Mrs. Patel, who initially refused, joined in after much coaxing from Marcus. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and camaraderie. Marcus and Nina took turns diving off a small ledge, while George and Mrs. Patel floated lazily near the edge of the pool. Sabrina watched from the sidelines at first, but eventually even she couldn't resist the allure of the moment. She waded in cautiously, letting the water wash over her as she closed her eyes and allowed herself to just be. Later, as the sun began to set, the group gathered around a campfire that Mateo had built near the waterfall. They shared stories, each of them opening up in ways they hadn't before. Marcus talked about his struggles with feeling like he didn't fit in at school. Nina spoke about her fear of never achieving her dreams. Mrs. Patel reminisced about her late husband and how he would have loved this adventure. Even Sabrina shared a rare glimpse into her life, admitting that she had become so focused on her career that she'd forgotten why she started in the first place. Finally, all eyes turned to George. He poked at the fire with a stick, his expression thoughtful. "Margaret and I always talked about coming to a place like this," he said softly. "But life got in the way, as it often does. And then, when we finally had the time, well, we didn't have the time after all." He looked up at the group, his eyes glistening. "That's why I'm here. That's why I brought all of you here. Because time is a luxury we can't afford to waste." The group fell silent, each of them reflecting on George's words. Then, one by one, they raised their cups in a toast. "To time," Mrs. Patel said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "And to making the most of it." "To time," the others echoed, their voices filled with a newfound determination. The next morning, the group said their goodbyes to Mateo in the valley. As they boarded the jet, there was a noticeable shift in their dynamic. They were no longer just a group of strangers on an adventure. They were a family, bound together by the experiences they had shared and the lessons they had learned. Sabrina, who had been quietly observing the group, turned to George as they prepared for takeoff. "I have to admit," she said, her tone softer than usual, "you've managed to pull off something remarkable here." George smiled, his eyes twinkling. "And we're not done yet." As the jet ascended into the sky, the group leaned back in their seats, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The journey wasn't over, but they had already gained more than they ever expected. And as they flew toward their next destination, they couldn't help but wonder what other surprises George had in store for them. The jet descended through a sea of mist, revealing a sprawling landscape of golden fields and quaint cottages that looked like they belonged in a storybook. The group had grown used to George's penchant for surprises, but this time even he seemed quieter than usual. He sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the approaching ground, a wistful smile playing on his lips. "Okay, George," Sabrina said, breaking the silence as they prepared to land. "What's the deal with this place?" "This one's special," George replied, his voice softer than usual. "It's not just about the place, it's about the people." The group exchanged curious glances but didn't press further. By now, they had learned to trust George's instincts. When the jet finally landed on a small airstrip, they were greeted by a cheerful older woman who introduced herself as Eleanor. "Welcome to Meadow Ridge," she said warmly. "We've been expecting you." "Expecting us?" Marcus whispered to Nina. "What does that mean?" Eleanor led the group to a charming inn at the edge of the village where they were shown to their rooms. The inn was rustic but cozy, with hand-stitched quilts on the beds and the faint aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. It was a stark contrast to the luxury of their previous stops, but no one seemed to mind. There was something comforting about the simplicity of the place. That evening, Eleanor gathered the group in the inn's dining room, where a hearty meal awaited them. As they ate, George finally revealed the reason for their visit. "This village," he began, "is where Margaret grew up. She used to tell me stories about Meadowridge, how it was the happiest place in the world for her. She always wanted to bring me here, to show me where she came from, but we never got the chance." The room fell silent as George continued. "So I thought, if she couldn't bring me here, I'd come for her, and I'd bring all of you, because she would have loved meeting every single one of you." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Eleanor, who had been quietly listening, placed a hand on George's shoulder. "She'd be so proud of you," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "and she'd be thrilled that you brought friends to share this place with." Over the next 2 days, the group explored Meadowridge, immersing themselves in its charm. They visited the tiny library where Margaret used to spend her afternoons, strolled through the fields she had once played in as a child, and even attended a local festival that seemed to bring the entire village to life. George was uncharacteristically quiet during these outings, often lingering at spots that seemed to hold a special significance. The group, sensing the weight of the trip for George, rallied around him. Marcus, who had grown close to George over the course of their journey, stayed by his side, asking him about Margaret and what she was like. Nina captured the essence of the village through her photographs, creating a collection she planned to give to George as a keepsake. Even Sabrina, who had kept her emotional distance for most of the trip, found herself drawn into the intimacy of the moment. On their final evening in Meadowridge, Eleanor organized a small gathering in the village square. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the cobblestone streets, and a local band played gentle melodies that seemed to wrap the entire village in a blanket of nostalgia. George stood at the center of it all, surrounded by the people he had brought and the memories he had come to honor. As the night wore on, George stood to address the group. His voice trembled as he spoke. Margaret always believed in the power of connection. She believed that people, no matter how different, could come together and create something beautiful. That's what I see here tonight. That's what I see in all of you. The group raised their glasses in a toast, their voices uniting in a chorus of gratitude and love. "To Margaret," George said, his eyes glistening with tears, "and to the life she inspired." "To Margaret," the group echoed, their voices filled with a reverence that transcended words. The next morning, as they prepared to leave Meadowridge, George lingered by the gate of the village, his hand resting on the wooden post. Eleanor stood beside him, her smile bittersweet. "You've honored her beautifully, George," she said, "and I have no doubt she's smiling down on you right now." George nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything." As the jet ascended into the sky, the group fell into a comfortable silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Meadowridge had left its mark on them, not just as a place, but as a reminder of what it meant to truly live and love. George, seated by the window, stared out at the clouds with a contented expression. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. Margaret's journey had come full circle, and in doing so, it had given him, and everyone he had brought along, a new beginning. The jet hummed softly as it climbed higher into the clouds, carrying its passengers to their final destination. George had grown more contemplative with each leg of the journey, but now he seemed almost serene. The group, sensing the weight of this last stop, refrained from asking questions, though curiosity burned in their eyes. Even Sabrina, who had grown fond of George's cryptic ways, felt a pang of anticipation. "This isn't just another stop, is it?" she finally asked as she adjusted the flight controls. George shook his head, his eyes distant as he gazed out the window. "No, Sabrina, this is the end of the line." The group exchanged glances but didn't press further. They had learned by now that George's answers would come in time, and when they did, they would be worth the wait. When the jet began its descent, the view that greeted them was unlike anything they had seen before. Rolling hills blanketed in wildflowers stretched out beneath them, dotted with small cottages and winding dirt paths. In the distance, a large, stately manor stood atop a hill, its windows glinting in the sunlight. It was a scene straight out of a fairy tale. The jet landed on a private airstrip, and as the group disembarked, they were met by a man in his late 40s wearing a crisp suit and a warm smile. "Welcome, Mr. Whitaker," he said, shaking George's hand. "Everything is prepared as you requested." "Thank you, Thomas," George replied, his voice steady but soft. He turned to the group and gestured toward the manor. "That's where we're headed." As they climbed into a waiting carriage, the group couldn't help but marvel at the beauty around them. The scent of fresh wildflowers filled the air, and the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves created a soothing melody. Nina leaned over to George, her voice filled with awe. "What is this place?" "It's the house Margaret and I dreamed of retiring in," George said, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "We saved up for it, planned for it, but life had other plans." The group fell silent as the carriage made its way up the hill. When they arrived at the manor, Thomas led them through its grand halls, showing them the rooms George had meticulously prepared. Each room was filled with little touches that spoke to Margaret's memory. A vase of her favorite flowers here, a bookshelf stocked with her favorite novels there. It was clear George had poured his heart into making the house feel like home. That evening, the group gathered on the manor's sprawling balcony, where a long table had been set for dinner. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. As they ate, George finally spoke. "This journey wasn't just for Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was for all of you, and for me. I wanted to honor her memory by living the way she would have wanted, by bringing joy, by connecting with others, by embracing life, and in doing so, I found a new family." Tears glistened in the eyes of his companions. Even Sabrina, who rarely allowed herself to get emotional, found her throat tightening. "George," she said quietly, "you've done more than honor her. You've inspired us all." The group raised their glasses in a toast. "To Margaret," they said, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, added, "And to George." After dinner, Marcus pulled George aside. "I never thought I'd say this, but you've changed my life, old man," he said with a grin. "This whole trip has made me realize there's more to life than just screens and Wi-Fi." George chuckled, clapping the teenager on the back. "And you've reminded me that it's never too late to learn new things." Meanwhile, Nina wandered the manor's gardens, capturing the scene with her camera. Mrs. Patel sat on a bench, knitting in the cool evening air. Sabrina stood by the balcony, her eyes fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. As the evening deepened, the group gathered one last time in the manor's great hall, where a roaring fire cast flickering shadows. George looked at the faces of the people who had become his family. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me something I never thought I'd find again. Hope." The next morning, the group prepared to depart. George stayed behind, waving from the steps of the manor as the jet lifted off. His companions watched him grow smaller in the distance, their hearts heavy yet full. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Nina asked quietly. Sabrina, seated in the cockpit, smiled faintly. "He'll be more than okay. He's home." And as the jet soared into the sky, the group carried with them the lessons George had taught them, not just about living, but about cherishing every moment. Though their journey together had ended, the bonds they had formed would last a lifetime. George, standing alone on the balcony of his dream home, looked out at the rolling hills and wildflowers and whispered, "We made it, Margaret. We finally made it."